Hi, everyone. Welcome to part two of our webinars with Kaya Oaks. Today, part two, crafting and revising. With the writing faith for a broad audience as our title for the series. Welcome back to those of you who were able to join us last Monday. If you weren't able to join us, we will have video of that presentation and also this one that we'll make available to you. So if you registered, we have your email address, and we'll send you the links to those once they're available. What some perks of joining us live today with Kaya are the opportunity to write and submit questions. And last week, Kaya really got a chance to go through, I think, everyone's questions, which was great. So if you have questions as we're moving through today, you can use the conversation chat box on the side of your screen. You can also ask us questions on Twitter with the hashtag writing faith. I'll put that in the chat box there as well. So feel free to reach out either of those ways, and we'll have some time at the end for some questions. Before I reintroduce Kaya to you, we're excited. We've scheduled another one of these sessions. There was good response to these, so we have another one that we'll do in May on communications and the crisis in the church right now. So we have Kim Daniels, who's at Georgetown University's Catholic Social Teaching Initiative. She's on the Vatican communications team. She helped put together the Vatican's meeting on the abuse crisis that just happened last month. So she's going to do a session for us on how do we talk about faith and communicate about faith in this time. So that'll be on Wednesday, May 8th. And we'll send out links for registration for that as well. But you want to save the date for that session. So I think that's all the housekeeping. Again, you've been muted and your video is blocked. So again, if you want to get in touch with us, it'll be through that chat box there or on Twitter at Jesuit News or at Kaya Oaks with the hashtag writing faith. And again, I'll throw that right into the conversation box as we get started. We had a great session last week. I thought Kaya did a really great job at being really kind of practical and for us as we're thinking about how do we kind of start to get our work out there, how do we write about faith, how do we pitch that to both religious publications and not religious ones. She shared some of her own pitching techniques and even examples with us. So again, you'll definitely want to go back and take a look at that if you haven't yet, once we get that sent to you soon. So those of you who don't know Kaya, she is a writing teacher. She teaches writing at University of California, Berkeley. She's written 4 books. She's publishes all over the place, articles, essays all over the place, including in the Catholic press and also in secular press. And again, is just a great teacher. We're really just happy to have her here to get us started with this series. Here at the Jesuit conference, where we're hosting this from, our hope is in our communications office to be able to present these opportunities to you to reflect and learn more a little bit about what it is to communicate, to kind of live in this intersection between communications and faith. So we hope to, again, continue to do that, both for the wide Jesuitic nation family, but also open up to everyone. So again, welcome. And thank you again for joining us here for the session. So without any further ado, we'll throw it over to Kaya. The session will be about an hour long today. So that's just about how long it worked out last time, and it seemed to go well. So you can plan on about an hour, and again, to use that chat box on the side for any questions. So we'll throw it to Kaya. Thanks, Kaya.
Hi, everyone. We are having a little bit of a connection issue here this morning. So if there's any problems with my voice or what you're hearing, can you drop a note in the textbook, and Mike and I will work out the issues with that. I can see that my video is slightly behind how I'm speaking, but you can follow the slides and I think everything will make sense no matter what happens. So welcome back. For those of you who were not here last week, I'm going to recap what we talked about in just a minute. But for today, if you have questions or anything, as Mike mentioned, there's a chat box on your left-hand side. And then you can also shoot me a line on Twitter, although I'm not looking at my phone while I'm speaking, but I will look at it later in the session and catch up with everybody's questions on there. And as Mike mentioned, if you have questions, you can use the chat function on the left, or you can @ me Kayaaoakes on Twitter, and then also at Jesuit News, which is Jesuit Communications Office, who are sponsoring this webinar today. So for those of you who were here last week, welcome back. And for those of you who were not here last week, here's what we went over last time. We talked a lot about the issue of audience and the purpose of writing about religion for a broader public in a time when conversations about religion are sometimes problematic, and that the fact is that writing for a broader public presents us with an opportunity to move the needle in national conversations about religion. Secondly, as writers, what you will eventually be able to do is to develop what we call a beat, which is a field of expertise, a specialization, a topic that you care about a lot, or something that you just find compelling to write about. And the more that you can develop your own beat and your own voice, in addition to compiling clips, which is previously published articles, makes you more appealing for editors to work with. And then finally, we talked last week about pitching and how you need to have your topic, a news peg, so something that relates to something that's recently happened in the news, and a sense of the audience of the publication that you're pitching to. So it's really, really important to read these publications that you want to write for before you try to write for them. So the pitching process we covered last week, and again, if you weren't here last time, you can watch the video when it's released and catch up with that. But once an editor says, yes, I'd love to work with you, here's your due date, the number one thing you have a responsibility for is making your due date. It's really easy to get on the naughty list, so to speak, and never work with publication again if you miss your deadline. So that is life and death stuff if you want to be a writer. So make your deadline. Your editor will give you a hard deadline, meaning you must finish the piece by this date. And then you also, they will often talk to you briefly about the audience of their publication and what that audience is looking for. So again, if you've already read the publication and you have a good, strong sense of their audience, that puts you 2 steps ahead of the game. But before you actually start writing a draft, there's a few things you really need to keep in mind. Writing is not a sprint or a marathon, if you have to use athletic metaphors. It's more like a circular process where we go back again and again to the same ideas. And I see I'm freezing up occasionally, so hopefully the voice is coming through. So think about writing as going in circles and not going in straight lines, and that'll be helpful when you get frustrated to understand that it's perfectly natural to have to go back to where you started in order to understand where you need to end up. So before you start to write a draft, even after your pitch is accepted, there's a few things you really need to get into place. One is that if you pitched an essay that involves reporting, so that means doing any kind of interviews or visiting what we would call a field site, so going to a church or a community group or classroom or park or something where events are taking place that you want to write about, you need to make sure that you have secured access. In other words, when you're interviewing people, this primarily means that you've asked them if you have their permission to quote them. So sometimes people will say, yes, you can quote me, but I want to use a pseudonym, or I don't want you to use my last name, and then you need to honor that and make sure that you don't do that. But most of the time, before we even write the pitch, we have that stuff lined up. So if your article involves travel, if your article involves interviews, if your article involves anything beyond you sitting at your computer, you need to have that planned before you even approach an editor, probably. If you've pitched an op-ed, so an opinion piece, you need to make sure you have enough evidence to support your arguments. You can't just make stuff up, obviously, and also you need to make sure that if the news cycle is going to change, that you can keep up with it. And also, do you need to do research? Do you need to do more research beyond the initial pitch that you made? personal essay, you really need to have what we call a so what idea. And that involves kind of thinking again beyond yourself and here's an event that happened to me. It needs to be something that connects to larger social or cultural issues. Otherwise, editors probably are not going to be interested, and readers are going to have a hard time caring about what you have to say. Sounds harsh, but that's the way it goes. And finally, I find this helpful for myself when I'm stuck in the weeds on a draft of an essay, or even before I start to write. Can I summarize what I'm trying to write in a single sentence? If you ask me what I'm writing an article about at a party, can I answer you fast enough that you won't walk away and go back to the bar? So that's a good litmus test to give yourself. When it comes to writing an essay, there's no magical method that's going to work for everybody. And so any kind of writing class or writing coach or book that offers to promise you a magical method that's going to help you write essays is ripping you off. So don't spend money on those things. However, there's a few methods to try, and what I recommend is trying all of them and figuring out what works best for you personally. Some writers like to start with an outline. This is very first year writing class in college, which I also teach. But outlines are great because they can help you to see the trajectory of your ideas and where your ideas are going. So I really like making outlines, and they can be as simple as a scratch outline, which is to say, I know my essay is going to be about 1,500 words, which is roughly 9 to 10 paragraphs. So I'm going to write 9 to 10 sentences that capture the idea I'm going to cover in each paragraph. 2, you could try starting your essay in the middle. So in other words, don't put the pressure on yourself of that perfect opening sentence and that perfect opening paragraph, and instead just jump right into the heart of things and then write the introduction later. And then finally, and this is what I'm going to talk about next, is beginning and ending your essay with a scene, S-C-E-N-E. The reason that I want to emphasize this is because the best and most powerful are ones that put the reader into the action of the essay with them. And so the art of writing those kinds of essays is really about writing scenes. So what do I mean by that? Okay, let's take a look. So a scene in an essay is the same thing as the scene in a TV show or movie. So if you look at this slide, you will see the opening paragraph from James Baldwin's essay, Notes of a Native Son, probably the greatest essay written in the English language, in my opinion. And go read it when we're done today. You can just Google it, and there's PDFs of it available online. But as you can see, what Baldwin does here is he puts us in the first sentence. He gives us a specific date and an event. On the 29th of July in 1943, my father died. On the same day, a few hours later, his last child was born. So you can see, like, within the first 2 sentences, we know what our topic is: fathers and sons, families, death, etc. And also, Baldwin has created action in those sentences. We have action verbs. So in other words, died, born. So the verbs are catching our attention. And then he backs up a little bit. Over a month before this, while all our energies were concentrated in waiting for these events, there had been in Detroit one of the bloodiest race riots of the century. So by stepping back in that sentence, what Baldwin's doing is giving us the social context. 1943, the racial situation in America was terrible, and he's going to back up in order to give us some context about how terrible it was and what that has to do with his relationship with his father. So you can, with this text if you'd like to. Unfortunately, my face is covering up half of the text on my slide, so I can't see it. But you can kind of see from this opening paragraph, which I think is really a masterful opening paragraph, that what it does is it zooms out and then it zooms back in again. So it zooms out to the larger social question of race and family and how race complicates family relationships, and then it zooms into this little kid, or this young man, James Baldwin, and his father dying in the midst of these race riots. Scenes are the bones of nonfiction writing. In other words, if your essay doesn't have scenes, then nothing's holding it up. And so scenes are what make the writer feel like they're engaged in your topic. So in this book, Storycraft, which is written by Jack Hart, who's the former editor of the Oregonian newspaper, he talks about some things that we need to consider when we're writing a scene. And I've just elaborated on his text here a little bit. So number one, you need to think about the point of view. And point of view is, are you going to write in first person, I, me, mine, second person, you or yours, or third person, they, the reader, one. First person is informal and conversational, and third person is formal and more scholarly or authoritative sounding. Second person, so where you talk directly to the reader and say, you should do this, or you should do that. You should really approach that with caution. Editors don't really like it when writers use second person, and it's very distracting. It's like, it feels like the writer's kind of yelling at you, and it's not friendly to readers. The second thing that you want to think about is tone. So tone is the emotional response that you want readers to feel. So how do you want people to feel? Do you want them to laugh, cry, feel empathy, feel pity, feel angry? So you can move through different emotions, but do think before you start to write about what the emotions you want to convey are going to be. And then finally is the issue that's related, which is style. So are you going to be formal or informal? Are you going to be conversational, or are you going to be scholarly, or are you going to go back and forth between the two? Those are just things to consider when you're starting to write. There are some things that you also want to consider when you're writing a scene, which is what kind of details are you going to include. If we look back to the James Baldwin that we just looked at, he sets the stage, but also makes a larger point, and that's exactly what a good scene does. Two, you want to think about collective details. So are you going to zoom all the way out to things like the neighborhood, the city? And that's how we live in communities. And so when you're writing about individual people, you need to talk about their communities too. Space, and space is three-dimensional. So when you include narrative motion, in other words, if you put somebody in a room, you're writing about somebody sitting in a room, it's more interesting to watch them entering the room and sitting down than to just have them sitting in the room. Think about establishing shots. So at the beginning of an essay, you maybe want to back up again and look a little bit further out and then go closer in later. Texture, so elements that contrast with one another. It's a rainy day, but it's warm inside. A man is angry, but 2 minutes later you see him crying. There are these kinds of things add texture to an essay, contrasts. Atmosphere, and so again, it's not just a rainy day, it's a rainy, cold, gloomy day, although don't use that many adjectives, but you get the idea. And then setting, which is evoking a particular time and place. It's very strange because I can see I'm a few seconds behind my voice, and it's a little bit weird, so I apologize for that. Okay, so what you see here, if you like graphics, is this nifty graphic, which is from Jack Hart's book that I just mentioned, Storycraft. And this is something to think about when you're figuring out the structure of your essay. So as you can see, it begins with exposition, and that's setting the scene of your essay. And then there are plot points that happen that lead up in an arc to what we call rising action. there's usually a crisis that happens somewhere in the essay, and then there's a climax, and then there's a following action, or what we call the denouement, which is French. Thank you for letting me know. I'm still coming through okay. The denouement is where you're winding things up towards the end of your essay. Now you may be wondering, if it's not a narrative essay, do you still need to have a narrative arc? So in other words, if you're writing an op-ed or a persuasive essay or a literary review, do you still need to have a narrative arc in your essay? And the answer is yes and no. Persuasive essays still need to have a narrative structure, and reviews need to have a narrative structure. Everything needs to have a narrative structure because life is a narrative, follow a narrative throughout our lives. But this idea of that your essay needs to have action and climax and a wind down at the end is super, super helpful to a lot of writers, and even professionals think about this idea. So something to keep in mind. What I've done for the next few slides to help you think about this is I've broken down one of my own essays, just a few paragraphs from it, so you can get a feel for how to approach a topic that has to do with religion and faith, but make it accessible and compelling to readers who are not in the same, perhaps, religion as you are, or who don't care about the issues as much as you do, and raise the stakes for them. So as you can see, this is from America Magazine, the Jesuit Review, which I'm a staff writer for, and it's from 2016. If you look at the date there, it says November 21st. Well, it actually came out online on Election Day, and so nobody read it because everybody was dealing with the election. But I really, really loved reporting this piece and writing it, and so I like to give it a little bit of life again when I can. We talked last week about the issue of not being able to figure out how to time when your pieces come out in relation to the news cycle, and so this is just something to keep in mind. The piece will often come out online 2 to 3 weeks before the print edition, and many publications don't even have a print edition. So sometimes your story will come out. I had a story come out on the day of the Kavanaugh hearings recently. I had a story come out on Election Day 2016. I had a friend who had a big story coming out yesterday when the Mueller report was released. So there's really nothing we can do to control those elements, but what we can do is just remind people about pieces that we've written and bring them back to them after the fact. So as you can see, when I was writing this piece, so this is a piece on Black Catholics in Oakland, California, where I live, and this church here called St. Columba that's doing this really amazing work around witnessing to gun violence. Oakland has one of the highest homicide rates in the USA, and this church is in the middle of this neighborhood that's rapidly gentrifying. So these Black Catholic parishioners who've done all this incredible social justice work are being forced out of the city where they grew up. And it's a really, I felt it was a really important story. And so as you can see in the first paragraph here, what I've tried to do is set the scene by describing the city or the street that the church is on, and the fact that the street actually runs through 4 days. And so we start in the greater Bay Area, and then we move gradually into the city itself. And then contrasting in the first paragraph the struggle of people living in poverty with the issue of gentrification. And what does gentrification look like? So I looked down to the neighborhood where the church is located, and I spent a lot of time driving by, but then I got out of my car, of course, and I spent some time just walking around. And by looking more closely, I could see things like the new condos that were going up and the new restaurants and how those were displacing people. So then in the second paragraph here, what I've done is I've zoomed in a little bit more on the church itself. So here we have at the intersection of San Pablo and Alcatraz Avenue, drivers and pedestrians regularly slow down in front of St. Columba Catholic Church to examine a monument to Oakland's continued grappling with violence and crime. White wooden crosses dot the church's front lawn. A sign reads, "These crosses represent those killed by homicide in Oakland this year. Each cross is marked with the victim's name, age, and date of death." So what that kind of detail does is, again, it puts the reader into the scene with you. And by zooming in that closely from the intersection to the church, to the crosses, to the names on the crosses, and to the sign that explains the crosses, we get it, hopefully what the reader gets is a sense of the issue and the problem that this church is grappling with that raises the stakes for readers. So now in the second two paragraphs, after the first two paragraphs, these are the third and fourth paragraphs. And in the third paragraph, I zoomed in even closer to introduce a character, and that's Father Jason Landeza, who was the pastor of the church who started this cross project, and he devised it as a symbolic response to the murder rate in the city. And so I introduced him and what he wanted to do with that, and then how Father Landeza saw the church's busy location as an opportunity to make a statement about the homicide rates, which had touched many members of his congregation. So what I tried to do there was to make it personal. In other words, to say this is how it's impacting individuals that go to this place and what that means to them. And then I zoomed out again at the end here in this fourth graph by talking about how at the end of each year they're removed, and they have this interfaith ritual where clergy from all different denominations come, and people come and everybody takes home one of these crosses, and they also burn some of them to make the ashes for Ash Wednesday. So it's quite moving to think about like all these rituals coming together and what that means. So that's just an example of a way that in an essay you can bring in both individual people and communities while also thinking about larger social issues and connecting religion and faith stories to larger social issues, as in this essay, race, gentrification, and gun violence. So what I have here next are a few questions for you to think about. So once you've written your draft of your essay, and you have your scenes, and you have your narrative arc, these are a few good questions for revision. You may remember at the beginning I said that writing is a circular process, and some of that circular process means that we have to keep thinking back to where we started and what the editor was interested in initially. So these are a few questions to ask yourself as you're revising an essay that can be really helpful with clarifying your thoughts and clarifying for readers what the points are that you're trying to make. So, for example, we have here, do I have a clear central idea? And is it clear within the first two paragraphs? So I'm not going to be as mean to all of you as I am to my own students and tell you that if you don't get your point across in the first paragraph, no one's going to care. But no one's going to care if you don't get your point across in the first two paragraphs. It's really, you don't need to have a thesis statement in the same way you do in academic essays, but you do need to make sure you say what you're saying and say it clearly so that the reader doesn't lose interest. Do I have enough supporting details and or supporting evidence? So supporting details is, did I do enough interviews? Did I do enough research? Do I have enough texture in my essay? Do I have support for my arguments? And are there any spots where that feels kind of weak or undeveloped? Editor's going to spot that right away and ask you to go back and fix that. And so as you're doing your own revision work, it's really helpful to go ahead and check and ask yourself that question. Do I have a so what, who cares idea? I talked about so what earlier as being the kind of something happened to me or something happened to the person or people I'm writing about. But why, so what? Why should the reader care? And who cares is just another way of saying the same thing. The issues that are important to me and that I want to write about are not always ones that readers are going to care about. And sometimes the pieces that I care about the most and really pour myself into as a writer are the ones that are the least read. But I like to think of that as maybe there weren't as many people reading it, but maybe the right people read it. And sometimes the letter you get from readers or comments and feedback that you get on social media do show you that the right people read it and that it actually made an impact on them in some way. And that's why we do the work. Do I begin with a hook that gets the reader's interest and then circle back to the idea by the end? So this is sort of a riff on a famous quote from the playwright and short story writer Anton Chekhov, who said that if you put a gun in the first act of your play, it has to go off by the end. And the same thing is true in essays. Whatever points that we make at the beginning, we should always circle back to by the end. And the idea of a hook in the introduction is the same thing that I talked about earlier in terms of scenes, but it can work in different ways. In an opinion essay, your hook might be something like a strong political statement or making something that makes the reader, make a statement that makes the reader really care about an issue. So that's your hook. So what's going to get the reader's attention, and more importantly, what's going to make them want to keep reading? Raise the stakes at the beginning, and it makes the rest of the work a lot easier later on. Have I stuck to my assigned word count? Okay, so editors hate it when you turn in a draft that's twice as long as what they asked for, because then they have to be the ones who go through and take out everything that you could have easily taken out in revision. And last week we talked about the idea of kill your darlings and how just because you love a line or an image or an interview quote, that doesn't mean your reader's going to love it, and that doesn't mean that your reader's going to care about it. So it's really important to adhere to your word count. Again, you won't be building relationships with editors, then treat them respectfully, and that means actually listening to what they say. If they ask for a 900-word piece and you turn in 3,000 words, they're not going to want to work with you again. So it's important to be respectful of your editors and do the work they ask you to do. And then finally, am I going to make my deadline? The answer is always yes, right? Always yes. Missing deadlines is the fastest way to end your writing career. It's also just, again, an issue of mutual respect. Making deadlines and making word counts makes you more reliable in the eyes of editors who then in turn will want to work with you again, but also just it treats them respectfully in the sense that they don't have a ton of free time and you don't have a ton of free time. So just pay attention to your deadlines. Last week, a number of you asked if I would talk briefly about the process of how to get a book written, and there's no way I'm going to be able to cover everything in the next 5 to 10 minutes because I want to leave time for questions at the end. But I thought I would go through like the really basics of how books are created, just to give you a sense of what the process is like and how many steps are involved. And so what I can then do, and what I've done at the end, is listed some recommended books on writing nonfiction for you to follow up with. So to publish a nonfiction book, which are very much some of the most important books being written today and sell very well, the problem is, again, that you need to develop a platform first. So very few writers are discovered out of nowhere. Most of them work for a really long time. They work really hard. And so they build up a platform of published clips. So they write for a long time and they get a reputation as being very good on particular topics. And then you need to find a literary agent. A literary agent is a person who negotiates contracts between writers and publishers. Now, some writers do not have a literary agent, and an editor from a publishing company directly approaches the writer and says, I'd like to work with you. Once in a while that does, but it's pretty rare. Most of the time, writers have the agent who's shopping the manuscript around for them. So a literary agent is very important. It's hard to get one though. So there's a lot of more writers than there are agents. And so you need to get a sense of what the agent you want to work with. So if you write young adult books, you don't want to approach a nonfiction agent, et cetera, et cetera. If you write cookbooks, you don't approach a young adult agent. So there are sources and lists of literary agent online. The one that a lot of writers use is called Poets and Writers Magazine. They have listings of agents in there, and then you can look up agents by topic. But the way most people look for agents, frankly, is they look around at their favorite writers and they Google up who their agents are. So in the religion writing sphere, if you like James Martin, or you like Elizabeth Johnson, or you like Rachel Held Evans or Nadia Bolz-Weber, just Google who their agents are, and you can write their agent a query letter saying, I'm a big fan of this author. I have an idea for a manuscript. Are you open to conversation about that? And the agent will either write you back and say, yes, I am, or they'll write you back and say, I'm not taking on new clients right now, or they won't write you back at all, which isn't personal. Again, it's that they're very, very busy and they get overwhelmed by queries. So the third thing you need to write a book is a strong stomach and nerves of steel. That's actually two things, but they kind of go together. I talked last week a little bit about how the publishing business writing is pretty tough. Magnify that by about 500,000, and that's the business of writing and publishing books. It's very difficult to get an agent, and it's very difficult for agents to find editors to represent books. But, you know, if your dream is to write a book, you'll figure out a way to make it happen. So nonfiction books always begin with a book proposal. And a book proposal is what you give to your agent, and then they go out and shop your proposal around to editors. And a book proposal usually consists of an outline of the chapters in your proposed book. And one or more of those chapters may be based on articles or essays that you've already written, and that's fine. One or two sample chapters, so those, again, should mostly, people prefer those to be original, but sometimes other people will accept a revised article as a sample chapter. You need a marketing plan. So a marketing plan is where you lay out things like where you would publish excerpts from your book, what magazines you have working relationships that would publish excerpts possibly. Do you have connections for speaking engagements? Do you have connections for a book tour? Unfortunately, publicity departments at publishers don't do a lot of that stuff for you. So the marketing plan is your opportunity to say what you're prepared to do. And then a statement about your platform, which is how many followers do you have on social media, or if you have, for example, a newsletter or a blog, how many readers does it have, how many how much traffic have your pieces gotten online, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, again, you really do have to have a presence on social media, and you need to have a platform to make yourself appealing to book editors. Even at publishers, they're increasingly realizing the importance of this stuff. So again, take a look online and see which writers that you like are doing social media well, and just try to follow their example. If you like what James Martin does on his social media, then you can look at the kinds of articles that he posts, conversations he has with readers, and kind of model yourself after him. Of course, he's one of a kind, but it's just something to think about. So how does the book actually get sold? So the agent shops the book proposal to editors, and then the editors go to the marketing department, and the marketing department is ultimately the one who decides if they're going to publish the book or not. I've had several experts really wanted to work with me, but the marketing department didn't feel that the book was something that was going to make the company money, and so they ended up passing on the book. And this is pretty normal. If any of you have, heard about or read any of my books, you can rest assured that the one that started my career as a religion writer, which is called Radical Reinvention, was rejected by almost 20 publishers before it finally found one. So, and that's pretty normal. But 10 years later, things have worked out okay. So the publisher then offers you an advance, and so that's a amount of money varying between $500 to $500,000, but you're never going to see anything like that latter end of the numbers unless you're a really big celebrity or you have a hugely viral story. And by hugely viral, I mean really got millions of shares. So, and that amount of money is split between your agent and you. The agent takes 10 to 20%, and then you have to pay taxes on it, and then you have to make it stretch because it's usually ends up not being very much money. The advance is paid in 2 to 3 parts. You get part of it when you sign the contract, part of it when you deliver the manuscript to the editor, and then sometimes you earn royalties. So once you sell enough books to earn back the amount of money the publisher gave you as an advance, you begin to get royalty checks 6 months after that. But these can vary again in amounts. Even if you do a lot of speaking and sell books at events, you have to be constantly hustling to get people to buy your books. So royalties are in no way guaranteed. Also, if you have an academic publisher or a religious publisher, the royalty rate is often, frankly, pretty low. And so this is where having an agent can be helpful with negotiating a better rate. Okay, so I'll answer those questions over on the left in a few minutes, but I just wanted to have 2 slides to help you out with where to go from here. This is a list of books that you might consider, and I'll post this on Twitter a little bit later today after we finish up. Recommended books on writing nonfiction. So the first one I've already mentioned to you today, which is Jack Hart's Storycraft, which I really like a lot. Thinking Like Your Editor by Susan Rabiner was recommended to me by my literary agent when I was writing my first book. And it's a really helpful guide, especially if you have an idea for a nonfiction book, but have no idea how to develop that into something that's 300 to 400 pages long. Dinty Moore, that is his real name, is the editor of Creative Nonfiction Magazine, and he is a great teacher, and his book, Crafting the Personal Essay, is very helpful if you're interested in writing first-person and personal essays. Philip Gerard's writing Creative Nonfiction is an anthology of essays by creative nonfiction writers about writing creative nonfiction. Telling True Stories by Wendy Kramer and Mark Call was put out by the Nieman Foundation at Harvard, which is a journalism kind of think tank institution. And it has some really good practical ideas about crafting story. I find that book very helpful as well, with the bonus that all the chapters are really, really short. And so you can just absorb the idea and move on. And then finally, a large but maybe worth checking out is The Art of the Personal Essay by Philip Lopate, which is an anthology of nonfiction going back to the Renaissance and to Michel de Montaigne, who's considered to be the father of the essay. And so you can find copies of that Lopate book very cheaply on Amazon or at your local bookstore, because it's assigned in a lot of classes. All these books should be findable, used as well. So you shouldn't have to spend too much money. And of course, you can get them out of your local library too. If you're interested in developing your writing further, I would love to work with all of you more, but unfortunately I do have that pesky full-time job at UC Berkeley on top of being a full-time journalist, so my life is pretty crazy. But I do have some strong recommendations for online classes that offer creative nonfiction in journalism or memoir, personal essays, or even if you want to start a podcast, which is really a form of nonfiction writing. All of these places are good places to start, especially if you're thinking about faith and religion writing. Catapult has online classes, Gotham Writers Workshop, and Creative Nonfiction Magazine all have really great accessible online classes that don't cost a terribly large amount of money. And then if you have the time to travel and would like to do more immersive writing workshop, I highly recommend the Glen Workshop in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I'll be teaching there this summer. My class is already sold out, but there are workshops there in all kinds of writing and visual arts, and it's an ecumenical Christian, so you're around other religious people or people interested in religion who want to make art. And then there's the Festival of Faith and Writing at Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan. That takes place every 2 years, so the next one will be in 2020. It's over 2,000 people, and it's panels and workshops that take place over, I think, 3 days. And the main speakers are really amazing. They've had everyone from George Saunders to Pema Chodron and all kinds of different religions, primarily with a Christian focus, but in interfaith conversations as well. And then if you want to keep it simple, your local community college is a wonderful resource, and as a public educator myself, I really want to support community colleges. And so community colleges often have classes, things like Intro to Journalism or Creative Writing. They're open to people of all ages, of course. And the teachers are often working writers who are doing this in the evening to make a little bit of extra money. If you live in a large urban area, there may be local writing workshops, like private workshops, available to you as well. And those are usually fairly easy to find through your local newspaper or your town's Facebook page or something like that. So that's just a few places to go from here. And I look at your questions in a second, but just again, you can get in touch with me on Twitter. You can get in touch with Jesuit News. Mike mentioned the upcoming workshop that you are offering on the sex abuse crisis in the church. So if any of you are thinking of writing about that, you may want to tune into that. I can't answer every individual question that people send me, but I do try to do my best. So let me actually, speaking of that, let me look at some of your questions over here on the left. So how do you know how much traffic your article is getting online? A lot of the time there's a little counter at the bottom of the article that tells you how many clicks or Facebook likes or it's gotten, and then if you yourself are posting it on Twitter, you can watch the retweets and likes in real time, or just follow the publication on Twitter. So that should give you a sense. And then you can kind of guesstimate from there. I had a funny experience last year. I published this essay at the website for the On Being podcast, and it had gone really viral, like way more viral than anything else I'd ever written. It had like over 20,000 shares. And then they reset the counter on the webpage and everything disappeared. So thank God I had screenshotted that to send to my literary agent. So what's the sort of minimum number of copies a trade publisher is looking to sell? They depending on the genre of the book and the predicted audience. So it really depends. A small religious publishing house, for example, is looking to sell something like 1,500 to 2,000 books. But if you make a deal with what we call the Big Four New York publishers, so that's like Penguin, Simon and Schuster, etc., and all their imprints, they want authors who can move tens of thousands of copies. So Harper One, which is one of the big religious publishers, they publish people like Rachel Held Evans or Nadia Bolz-Weber, like real big celebrity kind of religion names. And most people who are not really as well known will struggle to get their attention, frankly. When should you push back on an editor's edits on a piece? Specifically, how do you address heavy edits that like it's not your piece anymore? So I haven't frankly had a lot of experiences of edits that made it feel like it had completely erased my voice. So I haven't really experienced that, but I do find that back and forth can be helpful if an editor is saying that they want to cut so much or change so much that it begins to feel like I'm compromising on the initial vision that we agreed on.